Okay, everyone, I'd like to begin. This is welcome. This is our next event in our Smith Alumni Lead the Way. This is the South Asia Concentration Lecture Series. These are a group of students who've been here at Smith College and have somehow focused their studies on something to do with South Asia, who have now gone on into academia. They're either now professors or about to be professors, soon to be professors. So for us, it's a moment of kind of great pride and also a kind of marker of the success of the program. It's particularly exciting in these moments when students like Joe come back, who I worked with, all of us worked with. Jay, I think you.
I did. Wasted a lot of my time.
That we've worked with, who've now gone on and done such interesting work and surpassed us in so many ways. And now the teachers get to be the students who sit in the room and learn from the former student who now knows all kinds of things that we don't know. When Joe was here, he had a self-design major in Tibetan Studies, which is a combination of philosophy, art history, but also with a chunk of anthropology thrown in. Someone who really kind of sat on both sides of the humanities, social sciences divide. And one of my great pleasures when I knew that Joe was kind of destined for great things, just after he graduated, he sat in on a seminar of mine on South Asian visual culture, and he was stunning. And the rest of the class was kind of in awe and a little frightened. But it was clear at that moment that he had the kind of intelligence, drive, savvy, all those things, not just to be in a class, but to run a class. It was clear at that moment to me that graduate students would follow, and being a professor and all that.
Can I tell a Joe Leach story as part of this introduction?
Absolutely.
And this is one that I don't think Joe knows.
Must not be too important to me then.
Yeah, it's pretty good. Joe wrote a truly brilliant thesis, an honors thesis, on Palan Lama representations in the transmission of Buddhism to Tibet into Gugge. And Marilyn Lee and I chaired the committee, and after the presentation of the thesis, the oral exam, Joe left the room, and Marilyn Lee, who is not a person who says nice things about people,
He's tough.
said to me, if that had been a job talk, I would have said, hire the candidate right now. It was that good.
Anyway, Joe is now in Michigan, in Ann Arbor, and hardly a surprise, speeding through his dissertation, and will probably finish with a few years of funding kind of left in the bank. I don't think any of us are surprised that he would do it well and quickly and surpass everyone's expectations. No pressure, Joe. No pressure at all here. You're among friends. Anyway, it's just really nice to have you back, and we're really proud of you. So
Thanks. Well, I will say, I think despite my major being philosophy and art history, it's maybe not a surprise that I am pursuing religious studies and will probably get a job as a religious studies professor. So clearly that class had something to do with it. So this is based on research from my dissertation, which I am just in the sort of early stages of writing up and thinking through. And this was partially trying to map out historically how a teaching gets from one end of the Himalayas to the other in a fairly short amount of time, and then also why the version of that movement that I was being told in the field through people who actually practiced that teaching differed so much from the very few scholarly accounts that exist on it. So that's what we will be talking about today. I did cut out most of the long bits of translation, so we can talk about those later if you are at all interested. This is the town of Pema, also known as Rawalsar, and it is in the North Indian Himalayas. So today, Pema is a pretty thriving international Buddhist destination, and it's particularly important for Buddhists from across the Tibetan Plateau and the Himalayas. But it's also drawing increasingly pilgrims from North and South America, Europe, places in farther East Asia like Hong Kong and Taiwan frequent tourists and pilgrims to this location. Most of the studies focus on Sopema's fairly recent rapid growth in the 1960s in the context of Tibetans moving into exile. A few of the studies explore the town's prior Buddhist associations, and as a result, it's unclear exactly when or why Sopema emerged as a Buddhist destination in the first place. And it's also not quite clear, aside from the existence of Tibetans, why it became such an important place after the 1960s. So this paper is an attempt to explore how it developed as a pilgrimage destination from the late 19th to the mid-20th century. And I'm primarily arguing that the interest in Sopema prior to Tibetan exile is driven by the activities of a few particular kinds of Buddhist practitioners, specifically those from the Kagyu and Nyingma traditions, who pursue a kind of practice called Dzogchen, occasionally also overlapping with Mahamudra, which prioritizes personal practice and individual experience over monastic-based learning and scholarship. So these practitioners prioritize a kind of wandering where they will travel from place to place on multi-year-long pilgrimage trips, stop and practice in an isolated location, and then move on to another location where they will again stop and practice for a while. So basically their lives are these extended series of pilgrimages interrupted by, I stayed in this cave for a year and then I moved on. So I'm trying to argue that when you look at their particular movements, rather than the movements of Tibetans in exile as a broad category, Sopema's status as a Buddhist pilgrimage destination is part of very specific regional pilgrimage practices within a Western Himalayan context, as well as a cross-Himalayan context, among regions that are generally considered peripheral and unimportant to central Tibetan history at the same time. So I focus on an area called Spiti, which I have a pointer, is this area, kind of, there's Kannar in China. If you go just to the left of China, Lahul and Spiti. And Spiti was historically part of Tibet in the 10th to 16th century, and that's actually what I wrote my undergrad dissertation or thesis on, so I haven't traveled very far. But I found more interesting things to work on. So what I was looking at is how Spiti, which is in the red box, far, far western end of the Himalayas, starts to become an important location for teachings and practices that are developing. Oh, that's again, you can see where it is with respect to the state. Practices that are developing at the other end of Tibet in a place called Golok, which produced a whole lot of really important teachers in the 19th century. So I will start reading now. So the town of Sopema, it's also commonly known as Rawalsar, is currently located in the state of Himachal Pradesh, India, near the city of Mandi. It's a pilgrimage site for Buddhists as well as for Sikhs and Hindus, and the primary focus of Buddhist pilgrimage to Sopema is the lake at the center of the town. The lake's significance for Buddhists derives from the association between the lake and a figure called Padmasambhava. Padmasambhava, as those of you who are Buddhist studies students may know, were commonly referred to as Guru Rinpoche, and was an 8th century teacher who played an important role in introducing Buddhism to Tibet. As Tony Hubert notes, Padmasambhava is a, quote, figure of singular importance in the history of Tibetan Buddhism and in terms of the development of a Tibetan sacred geography. The reputed life and deeds of Padmasambhava during his claimed late 8th century visit to Tibet have served as one of the principal bases of traditional authority for claiming a place to be a religious site in the Tibetan world, end quote. So Padmasambhava's popularity with Tibetan and Himalayan audiences developed in much later centuries, in part in response to the circulation of his life story. These accounts describe his activities and movements throughout the Himalayas, focusing in particular on points where he conquers a particular locale, usually through the person of the local protector deity. So he'll combat the local protector deity, subdue them, and then bind them to serve Buddhism. In the case of Pema, there is no evidence of a Buddhist association with this site prior to the 19th century. But at some point in the 19th century, or maybe just before, Padmasambhava's life becomes associated with this lake, particularly a scene where he is burned alive in the kingdom of Zahor. Now, where exactly Zahor is has been a problem since Padmasambhava purportedly lived in the 8th century. Most earlier Tibetan accounts place it in either Bengal or another North Indian location, or farther to the west in Pakistan, or an area called the Swat Valley. Despite those associations, whenever Tibetans have gone on pilgrimage there, they do not find anything called Zahor. So Zahor has sort of been a floating signifier with no actual pilgrimage destination attached. Zahor becomes identified with this lake, and particularly with floating islands that are not pictured because they don't exist anymore, but at some point there were floating islands in the middle of the lake, which were thought to be the lotus from which Padmasambhava emerged when he was attempted to be burned alive. Sadly, I've never seen the floating lakes, because they're gone. Okay. So, do a brief overview of the two people who have written about this so far. The most thorough work to date attending to this history is Tony Hubert's The Holy Land Reborn, Pilgrimage and the Tibetan Invention of Buddhist India. It's from 2008. So in this work, he explores the changing relationship between Tibetans and India, particularly through pilgrimage practices, and focuses on how Tibetans' engagement with India is shaped by an understanding of India as the birthplace of Buddhism. The relevant chapter for me is in part 2, chapter 8, which he calls The Precious Guru in the Punjab. He traces Pema's emergence as a Buddhist pilgrimage site as one example of a much larger trend in which Tibetans develop these connections through pilgrimage with locations in the Punjab. He says they're primarily mapping Tibetan Buddhism onto existing Sikh pilgrimage locations, and argues that Tibetans likely began traveling to Pema possibly in the late 18th, but the earliest account that exists is from 1817, so probably early 19th century. This developed into a steady stream of pilgrims throughout the 19th century, which he says then waned for a period in the early 20th century before it exploded substantially in the 1950s and 60s with Tibetans moving into exile. He proposes that the impetus for Tibetans to move into the farther western Himalayas was increased military unrest in central and eastern Tibet, particularly the Gurkha invasion of Tibet in the late 18th century, as well as some battles between the Nyaran kings and the Derge kingdom in eastern Tibet. These pushed Tibetans away from the east and out of Tibet as they fled the violence, and they established themselves in areas to the south and west of Tibet. So this is what he proposes happened in the case of Pema. Additionally, at that point, they were aided by colonial infrastructure like trains and better roads, so they could reach areas in the Punjab that they didn't necessarily have access to before. Okay, so Hubert suggests that the locations of Amritsar, where the Sikh Golden Temple is, Lahore, and Rawalsar, Pema, all become key Buddhist pilgrimage destinations. In the case of Amritsar and Lahore, he suggests that Tibetans confused the Sikh guru for the guru of Guru Rinpoche, proposing that they're aided by the similarity between Lahore and Zahor, which sounds like it could have happened. But his only evidence to support that comes from one colonial source who is reporting something a Tibetan told to him. And then his other source comes from Rudyard Kipling's novel Kim, which is about the relationship between a young British boy and a Tibetan Lama on pilgrimage in India. And I should note that that novel, while entertaining, does not actually mention a place called Zahor. So sort of remains to be seen, why did Tibetans develop an interest in this location in the first place? Hubert proposes similar confusion linguistically must have occurred at Pema, since Pema is also in the Punjab and also has must have a substantial Sikh presence, since the Punjab is primarily associated with Sikhism. To support this case, he goes to another example from the other end of the Himalayas in Arunachal Pradesh, where in 2002, he saw local Buddhists on pilgrimage to a cave dedicated to Guru Rinpoche, alongside Sikhs on pilgrimage to a Gurdwara nearby. He talked to a retired colonel from a military regiment that built the Sikh Gurdwara, who said that the local Buddhists are worshiping both the Buddha and Nanak Rinpoche, by which he means Guru Nanak, one of the Sikh gurus. So he sees this comparison made by a Sikh military official and then applies it retroactively to Pema, which I found a bit dissatisfying of an answer. He concludes that, quote, the collapsing together of both Sikh and Tibetan Buddhist references is found today at sites throughout the Himalayas. I have personally encountered it, and in my own research in the far eastern Himalayas, i.e. Arunachal Pradesh. So there's very little to support this linguistic confusion actually having taken place, although it very well may be true. And I would also say I haven't found the answer. I wish I had. I'm still looking. But his narrative is largely one of Tibetans moving into India. So for his purposes, this is yet another instance of Tibetans as a whole group moving into India as a whole group, despite the fact that the India he's referencing doesn't really exist at that point. For example, in the 19th century, Pema and Rawalsar are part of the kingdom of Mandi, not the Punjab. And they only become the Punjab much later in the mid to late 19th century when the British come in and establish a region called the Punjab province for their administrative purposes. So the idea that because Mandi was once part of the Punjab, it must have a Sikh presence isn't actually historically true. So again, his argument basically requires one to accept wholesale in India and wholesale in Tibet. So, sorry. This is the central claim. So that's the central claim of his book as a whole, which he's reiterating throughout. And again, as I mentioned, is subtitled Pilgrimage and the Tibetan Invention of Buddhist India. So it requires a Tibet and a Buddhist India. And it does little to explain why Pema emerges as an important site. In this treatment of the later development of Buddhist pilgrimage to Pema, i.e. in the 20th century and when Tibetans move into exile, which is when most people are interested in discussing this location, he relies primarily on the work of Kathy Cantwell, who wrote a dissertation in 1989 based on studying Tibetan refugees at the Nyingma Gompa at Pema. At that time, the Nyingma Gompa was the only monastery there, and it had been founded in the 1960s by Dudjom Rinpoche, who's one of the most important Tibetan teachers of his time. Cantwell's study prioritizes the Tibetan identity and exile status of the Buddhist pilgrims at Pema. And she posits that the situation for pilgrims at Pema was radically altered by Tibetans in exile, i.e. it only became a very important site rather than just a marginally important one because Tibetans in exile are forced to find new locations. She argues that the Nyingma Monastery was primarily founded in order to preserve Tibetan traditions in exile. Quote, the monks are participating in the wider preservation of mainstream Nyingma teachings, end quote. And she also describes the town of Pema as a refuge for Tibetans who are, quote, in an alien environment, particularly those Tibetans who don't want to settle down in South India. For them, Pema, with its existing tourism practices, provides a opportunity to, quote, avoid some of the modernizing influences of a completely new environment and social structure, end quote. So in this version of events, Pema is only populated by Tibetans because they are forced to go there because they are in exile. The locations appeal is as a refuge from change in other, less familiar locations and provides an opportunity to preserve something lost. So they arrive at this periphery only as they are displaced from a center, i.e. Tibet. So this is quite similar to Hubert's explanation of why Tibetans discover Sopema in India in the 19th century, which he attributes to warfare changing existing pilgrimage patterns along Tibetan's Himalayan frontier. So in both cases, Sopema becomes a place that is an exception to a rule. It's resorted to rather than sought out. So one of the key issues with this is the center-periphery model of pilgrimage that is dominant in much of Tibetan studies, as well as both authors' uses of the terms Tibetan and Buddhist. So while Cantwell notes throughout her dissertation that there are Buddhists at Sopema who are not Tibetan refugees and acknowledges that they played roles in maintaining Sopema as a Buddhist pilgrimage destination, she never actually considers their motivation for being involved with the site or how they were involved in the foundation of the monastery, if the monastery exists to preserve Tibetans in exile. One of the reasons that this is obscured throughout her work is that she continues to use the term Tibetan Buddhist to gloss both the Tibetans in exile as well as Buddhist practitioners who are not Tibetans in exile. So like Hubert, Cantwell's use of Tibet and India is somewhat anachronistic and relies on contemporary borders between India and a Chinese-occupied Tibet, as well as the assumption that any Buddhists in India must have been displaced or come from somewhere else. And I guess I did not establish this at the outset, but Lahul in Spiti is predominantly Buddhist, as is Kannar, although Kannar is about split in half. So most of these Buddhists who are present at Sopema who are not Tibetans are people who live in this state, not too far from Sopema, and who have a history of going to Sopema. So technically they are Indian citizens. They are not Tibetan refugees, nor are they Tibetans in any sense of the word. So that Cantwell views these Buddhists in the contemporary state of Himachal Pradesh as somehow displaced Tibetans, or at least as Tibetan Buddhists, is evident in her description of the temple that existed at Sopema prior to the foundation of the new monastery. Quote, "The small Tibetan temple, which had been maintained by Buddhist villagers long settled in India, has now become a thriving Nyingmapa monastery." End quote. So the idea is that the temple was there, must have been Tibetan if it's Buddhist, and any Buddhists who are there, the Buddhist villagers, are long settled in India. So somehow they came to an India from somewhere else. So the use and misuse of terms like Tibetan Buddhism has long been critiqued by scholarship, particularly in 1989 by Donald Lopez, whose Prisoners of Shangri-La showed the history of the term and suggested we move away from using it. Granted, her dissertation was written the same year, so she sort of picking on her to ask her to move away from a term that she may not have problematized at the time. But my argument would be that in using that term, she's prevented herself from seeing other narratives that might possibly have existed because Tibetan Buddhism is a uniform category for her. So in light of this is the existing scholarship. Now I'm going to briefly suggest, briefly recap that. Now I'm going to try to suggest what I think might have happened at least in the late 19th century and early 20th century when Sopema starts to emerge as a Buddhist pilgrimage destination, but before Tibetans move into exile. And again, I don't actually know when it happened prior to this period, but maybe I will find it. So, go back to this map. So the 19th century was an important period for Buddhist development in the far eastern regions of the Tibetan Plateau, particularly the areas of Kham and Amdo. This period is frequently referred to as the Rime or non-sectarian movement, and that movement was born in part out of a rejection of central Tibetan currents, and specifically the Gelug dominance of central Tibetan monastic institutions. So it developed in places like Kham because, in part, central Tibetan control was much more limited. Lhasa didn't actually have very much say in what went on in the monasteries there. And it was a non-sectarian movement was also dominated by two traditions in particular, the Kagyu and the Nyingma. And both of these movements flourished in part because they received patronage from these petty kingdoms that were active there and resulted in the warfare that eventually pushed some of these people out. And so I'm going to focus within the broader flourishing of Kagyu and Nyingma. There are two sub-movements. One is called the Terma movement, or tradition, and the other is the ideal of the wandering madman or yogi. So Hubert does note that there is a movement of people out of common amdo, but he explains that movement as a result of warfare rather than any sort of volitional activity on the part of these Buddhist practitioners. So within a perhaps Buddhist understanding of why they might have moved, during the Rimé period you have types of practice that encourage mobility. Figures usually referred to as drupchen or yogis perhaps, or siddhas, reject life at a settled monastic establishment in favor of one where they pursue a solitary lifestyle of retreat and pilgrimage. So they pursue a lifestyle as wandering pilgrims, which is necessarily going to have them move throughout the Tibetan regions and out of Kham. They also frequently engage in unconventional behavior, saying they're doing strange things, perhaps. So one of the most well-known visual traits are long matted locks that form on their hair as they spend years sitting in caves. Many of these refer to themselves as madmen, again as a gloss for their unconventional behavior. And that's not to say the wandering siddha emerged during the Rimé period, but they didn't particularly flourish during that time. So in their wandering, most of these yogis followed existing pilgrimage routes. Their biographies describe sort of a rhetoric of wandering, but they are specifically going from location to location. Most scholarship on Himalayan pilgrimages interpret this as orchestrated from a center-periphery model. As Peter Schweiger argues in his study of the well-known pilgrim Taksang Repa, quote, most of the journeys of the Tibetan clergy took place within the same geographical frame, which was fixed by tradition. Mostly there were journeys from the periphery of Tibetan civilized regions to the holy places and centers of Buddhist learning in central Tibet, end quote. So Schweiger is specifically interested in Taksang Repa because his is an exceptional case where he travels west, farther than Mount Kailash, which you can see right here above the two little lakes. The idea that Tibetan pilgrimage is based on a center-periphery model is not only sort of taking a sort of dominant central Tibetan position, but it's also prioritizing Gelug understandings of pilgrimage over Kagyu and Nyingma understandings of pilgrimage, as most Kagyu and Nyingma pilgrimages are working along the Himalayan border. Okay, so Schweiger, like others, only understand movements away from the center-periphery model as a disruption or an exception, as in the case of Taksang Repa, or in Hubert's case, these displaced wandering yogis. So in the 19th century, many of these wanderers who were highly active across the Himalayas went so far as Kailash and beyond to Pema. And in their biographies, they do not describe their movements as unusual or as extending into unknown territory. They know that they are going to Pema where there is a Buddhist presence, and they seek it out, which, given how the difference between how they might describe their actions ideally and reality, is still interesting in that they know they can go there and practice. So, in addition to the Rimé movement flourishing for these wanderers, there's an expansion of what is called the Terma tradition, where you have teachers who are called treasure revealers who locate teachings either in their own minds or in the landscape or in particular objects like statues. So proponents of the Terma treasure traditions believe that Padmasambhava, the same figure associated with the lake, hides the teachings in the 8th century so that they can discover them later. And the recipients of these teachings can choose to keep them secret or pass them on. So 2 important Terma practitioners from the 19th century Rime movement were Chogyal Lingpa and Dujam Lingpa. Chogyal Lingpa lived from 1829 to 1870 and wrote a prayer to the guardian deity of Pema, but he lived in Golok and never went to Pema. So this implies that by the mid-19th century, Pema was popular enough that its reputation had reached all the way back to Golok. Dujam Lingpa never wrote about Pema, but he's considered, again, a very important Terma practitioner whose work is the work that I mentioned at the outset, who makes its way back to Spiti. So Chogyal Lingpa embodies an intersection of the Tertin and this crazy madman. In the prayer to the deity of Pema, he signs the text, quote, that this is the shit of Terchen Choling, written by himself for the lake by a thoughtless, fickle one. So he's calling himself sort of thoughtless, and he's just writing this crap, but it's for the lake. Okay, so then to move on to Dujam Lingpa. Dujam Lingpa lived from 1835 to 1904 and was also from the region of Golok. His collective body of work is known as the Dujam Terma. He had many students in the East, as well as several who became well-known teachers and Tertins in their own right. One of his most important disciples, also from Golok, was Dewa Gyalpo, who's also known as Etaraja. He lived from 1873 to 1933. And when Dujam Lingpa died in 1904, Etaraja went to Pemako to find his reincarnation. They found the young boy who would grow up to be Dujam Rinpoche, the founder of the Nyingma monastery in Pema. After they found the young reincarnation, Etaraja goes on extended pilgrimage himself. His wanderings take him all the way to Kailash, where he settles in a cave, again, Kailash far west, where he settles in a cave at the foothills of the mountains and takes an extended 3-year retreat. He comes out of retreat, teaches some students, goes back in retreat, does 2 3-year retreats. At that point, his fame as a practitioner has started to spread, and he starts to draw students from throughout the Western Himalayas, including Lahul, Spiti, Kannar, and then farther to the north, Ladakh and Zanskar. So they're all settling at Kailash to take teachings from him. And eventually the group of students becomes so large that he has to found his own monastery, which is called Namkha Kyungzong, and it became the major Dujam Lingpa center in Western Tibet. So Etaraja wasn't the only Dujam Lingpa teacher to make his way that far west. There were 2 others, Sokang Rinpoche, who did not leave any written texts, so we don't know very much about him. But then the third, Pema Lungtok Gyatso, also from Golok. His biography is one that I am translating parts of for my dissertation, so I'm going to talk about him for a little bit. So Pema Lungtok Gyatso was a student of Dujam Lingpa. He's also called Golok Serta Rinpoche, and the fact that he's called Golok Rinpoche means he's from Golok, which is really only important if you leave Golok, because you can't really be called the guy from Golok if everybody is around you also from Golok. So he traveled quite far to the west, again after Dujam Lingpa died. He initially went on pilgrimage to central Tibet. He tried to settle at a monastery, but his biography describes conflicts with the monks there, and they make fun of him. He decides to leave. He describes it as them being jealous of his practice. So then he starts to wander again. He encounters several other important Rime teachers from the east, including Adzom Drukpa, who is a famous dual lineage holder of both Kagyu and Nyingma teachings. Adzom Drukpa tells him to go to the west. He says your students are there. So he sort of predicts that Pema Lungtok Gyatso should keep wandering. So he does, and on the way he encounters Sokyung Rinpoche, who says, "Oh, we should go to Kailash. There's this guy here who's from Golok, our hometown, also studied with Dujam Lingpa." So Pema Lungtok Gyatso says, okay, and they go. They circumambulate Kailash. In his biography, Pema Lungtok Gyatso says that he's planning to go to Sopema after Kailash. So his ultimate destination is to go beyond Kailash to Sopema. But when he encounters Itaraja, who becomes his second root teacher, Itaraja says, no, you haven't done the preliminary practices yet, you have to stay here. So he stays for 3 years, does his 100,000 recitations, and then gets pulled into the institution that Itaraja had founded, giving teachings in the summer, and then everybody goes off in the winter to do their own personal practice. He eventually does make it to Sopema in 1923, and on that visit, he encounters students. He specifically lists students from Spiti. So this is, again, zooming in on that map. He encounters students who are from the Pin Valley in Spiti. And the Pin Valley is the only part of Spiti that is Nyingma. The rest of it is Geluk with a small pocket of Sakya practitioners. So he encounters students from the Pin Valley, and he teaches them Dujam Lingpa teachings. And then he goes back to Namkha Kyungzong. So there he takes on students who were Itaraja's own students, who are also from Spiti. And they come to the mountain, and then they go back to do their retreats. Anyway, I cut all of the long passages quoting his biography, but basically he does this like 3 times. He leaves, he comes back, he leaves, he comes back, he teaches students. The last trip he made to Sopema was in 1953, and at that time after his retreat, he did a circular pilgrimage from Sopema through Kelang to an important temple called Trilokanath, and then comes back down through Spiti and then leaves the Sutlej Valley to Kailash. And this is a very well-known pilgrimage circuit within the Western Himalayan context. So Pema is on what in his biography is described as a pretty active loop that people do. They go to Sopema and then they circle around and go back to Kailash. And he lists all these teachers that he met at the time, both local teachers and teachers from Kham and Amdo. That was his last trip, because when he returns to Kailash, the Chinese have entered Tibet and shut down the border. He escapes over the border into northern Nepal, where he died a short while later, and his son, who was himself recognized as an incarnation of Itaraja's teacher, founded a second Namkha Kyungzong after he heard that the first one was destroyed. So to take a moment to look at the kind of other half of the talk's title, what does this really have to do with Spiti? Nyingma Buddhists from Spiti, I think, played a fairly important role in the late 19th, early 20th century development of Sopema, which is hinted at in Pema Lungtok Gyatso's biography, but becomes a little more apparent if you do field work and interviews with people from Spiti and also look at inscriptional evidence from the Pin Valley. Okay, so 2 students in particular from Spiti who established themselves at Namkha Kyungzong were important. One was Yeshe Palden, who is from a border town that was part of Tibet, but then becomes part of Spiti after the Sino-Indian War in 1962. Right now it's still showed as contested territory on the map. So technically he's a Tibetan who became an Indian, who was a Gaelic who became a Nyingma. His lifestyle, his life story is described in pro-Nyingma terms as a rejection of Geluk scholasticism. He joined Tashi Lunpa Monastery, a very important monastery, as a young monk. His life story recounts that he rose in the ranks to become an umse, a fairly highly respected figure. When he heard the name of his teacher, realized that all of these titles would get him not, and he fled, according to some, by sneaking out the bottom of the toilet. Ran off to meet his teacher and became a Nyingma practitioner. He took on as a student someone named Yome Dorje, who was born in the Pin Valley. Who goes on pilgrimage with him, not only to Kailash, but they go almost as far as Mount Sari, which is closer to Common Amdo than it is to Spiti. So they're very active in the Western Himalayan pilgrimage circuit as well. Pemalung Gyatso's biography recounts that on his last trip in 1952, he actually accompanies Yeshe Palden, Yeshe Palden is by then dead, but he accompanies Yome Dorje back to the Pin Valley, where they rebuild a temple that had burned down. And that temple is still standing today. So these two figures are responsible, these three figures all together are responsible for introducing the Dujam Lingpa Terma to the Pin Valley. After the border is shut down in 1961, Yome Dorje dies, and because they can't go to Tibet anymore, they can't go to Kailash, they try to find a Dujam Lingpa teacher who they do have access to. And according to Yome Dorje's nephew, Kunzang Namdrol, who was, he passed away last year, but I talked to him in 2014, he said that when Yome Dorje died, they gathered all the elders from Pin and went all the way to Kalimpong at the other end of the Himalayas to meet Dujam Rinpoche and ask him to come back to Spiti to recognize the next incarnation of Yome Dorje. He said that Dujam Rinpoche agreed, they left and went back to Spiti, and less than a year later, Dujam Rinpoche arrives in Sopema. So Dujam Rinpoche goes to Sopema, goes to the Pin Valley, and then goes back home to Kalimpong. This is the trip when he founds the temple at Sopema. So according to local Spitians' understanding of events, they've initiated Dujam Rinpoche's travel to the location in Sopema, where he founds a temple in part for them. And this is reinforced today. The head monk at that monastery is from Spiti, as are many of the monks who live there. He came again 1 year later in 1964 and gave some major initiations for the Dujam Lingpa Terma. For many Spitians who are in their 50s and 60s today, they recall going to Sopema for that particular initiation, which drew large crowds. So all this is to say that, on the one hand, the narrative of Tibetans in exile is that Dujam Rinpoche went to Sopema because he was in exile, he didn't really have anywhere else to go. But according to the Spiti understanding of it, they already had an existing relationship with his predecessor and with his predecessor's teachers, and had established both Sopema and Spiti as kind of power places for this particular practice. So it made sense that he would then go there and join them. And I should note that the only existing biography of Dujam Rinpoche doesn't mention Spiti at all, which is interesting. So it may be a difference between a local understanding of his importance and a Tibetan understanding of his importance. So it may not be possible to know which thing exactly drew Dujam Rinpoche to Sopema, whether he went to found a new monastery or whether he went to recognize the new incarnation in Spiti and then subsequently founded a monastery. This story doesn't show up at all in the accounts by Hubert Cantwell because these people would fall under the category of Tibetans going to India, even though they technically are already in India. And the second half of this is what I'm not going to talk about today, but Cantwell's account of Tibetans' presence at Sopema is predicated on them being poor, powerless Tibetan refugees who don't have access to other forms of institutional support. Conversely, the Spiti practitioners who go to Sopema go from a position of subsistence farming and poverty to a position where their lives are heavily subsidized by the Indian government. They now spend 3 to 6 months of the year wintering in Sopema, where it is much nicer than Spiti, renting apartments, buying their food. So on the one hand, you you have the idea that people are settling here because they can't afford to be anywhere else, versus a community who are settling there because it's a vacation that they can afford in relative comfort. But I'm not going to talk about that today. So what I'm trying to trace mostly is how the Dujam Cherma gets from Golok all the way to Spiti, and so Pema, by following a couple of practitioners who are mostly Nyingma, but there's also a second monastery that is founded at Sopema that's Kagyu, and the founders of that monastery are also local Western Tibetan students of a teacher from Amdo, who's Kagyu. So the same thing happens for the second monastery. You have a connection between this, the West and these students that is ignored in most accounts. Okay, so these kinds of stories are different from the idea of exile as a forced migration, or the selection of Sopema as a coping with the changes of modernity, which is what Cantwell argues. And it shows that trying to treat Tibetans as a uniform category, crossing the Himalayas to colonize an India that is not already Buddhist, doesn't necessarily work when considering this Western Himalayan context. I think that ideally oh, sorry, I didn't show you. This is Golok Sota Rinpoche, who I talked about. So Gray Tuttle has argued in an article called Challenging Central Tibet's Dominance of History that when we look at regional histories, we often find things that are quite different than the histories we get when examining them from Central Tibet. And I think perhaps this would be the case. And that if more people do regional histories, we get a different idea of what pushes Tibetans over the Himalayas and into Sopema in the first place. And then lastly, I also think while Cantwell, whose whole body of work is focused on the Nyingma, might disagree, that her work is in some ways implicitly Gelug biased in that it only sees movement to these locations as prompted by a disruption rather than something that is sought out by particular Kagyu and Nyingma practitioners. So, yeah, that is also, this is part of a larger argument where I'm trying to look at how Spiti emerges as a Buddhist destination in its own right. That is the end.
So can we entertain some questions, students and others? Students always get first chance.
That's fine. Sure.
Still going to India every summer?
Yeah. Yep, most summers. I didn't go last year. But yeah, go ahead.
Well, I guess I'm fascinated by how difficult it is to find all of the information you need to kind of formulate points of view. Not you,
Mhm.
but just that there is so little inscriptional evidence, that there's, I'm wondering if there are tales to tell in these caves where people
Mhm.
were, sequestered
Yeah. Well, I guess not. Yeah, the caves are, I guess they're out of this picture, unfortunately. But these caves in particular don't have anything useful in them insofar as they've been completely taken over post-1950s. But other caves very well might. Yeah. Sorry, did I cut you off?
No,
Yeah.
I was fascinated by potential artifacts that could perhaps allow you to
Yeah.
more definitive about the religions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I will say part of the problem is a lack of evidence. And in the case of Hubert, he made an argument based on what he had. I think he made the convenient argument to support his overall claims in the book. But when there's no evidence, maybe the best thing is not to make an argument rather than to try to make an argument that fits your picture. So there isn't really anything to pin down what happens here prior to 1817, which is the earliest evidence, and that in and of itself is from a British colonial officer who's scouting out the area. And most of the sources from the 19th century are colonial sources, so it's through that lens. But I think that if people read more biographies in Tibetan, probably they'll find more bits of information. Yeah. Not a cave, but I did crawl around in a temple and scrape accumulated mud off of an inscription that was mostly obscured, and in that process found some really useful information about teachers from Bhutan who were active in Spiti in the 17th century. So sort of nobody really knew the history of this temple, and everybody kept writing in books. Nobody knows the history of this temple, but then if you go in and kind of dig a little bit, literally, you can find something out maybe. Yeah. Sure.
So, are there other examples in the Western Himalayas, in the Himachal area, of these long-distance relationships between areas here and areas in common Amdo? I mean, this reminded me of the weird relationship between Mustang and, I guess, Labram.
Yeah.
Right? There are these weird connections across the Tibetan plateau of tiny peripheral areas on the east and the west, or the north and the south. Wondering
Yeah.
are there other weird pairings like this we don't be thinking about?
Yeah.
Also tell us about how Tibetans thought about space in the past.
Yeah, the Mustang connection is interesting, and a little before the Mustang-Lebrun collections, there's actually a relationship between Spiti and Mustang because there was a regional Sakya king who had power in those areas, and that's pretty much forgotten at this point. In the case of the Western Himalayas, there's another connection, not with Golok, but with slightly farther north in Amdo, and Shakya Shri, who was another famous 19th century practitioner. His students he sent a student to Lahul to try to go uncover these old sites that were associated with the pilgrim Gutsangpa, and his student went and then came back, and when he came back, he brought some 20 students. So those students all trained with Shakya Shri and then went all the way back to Lahul. And they found the third monastery at Pema eventually in the 1980s. It's much later. But the Gutsangpa connection is with most of the major Drukpa Kagyu monasteries. I think that the situation with Ladakh and Zanskar has been much more well studied, but there are many Western Himalayan and then south or far Eastern Himalayan connections. I mean, my guess, to keep beating a dead horse, is that most of the histories of Tibet that are large-scale histories of Tibet were written after the 16th century or during the 16th century by Gaeluks in central Tibet. So they're not really interested in what's going on at the periphery, in part because the periphery is not where the Gaeluks are most active. The clearest pictures of Spiti's history is really just during the period where Tsongkhapa's students are colonizing and sort of spreading out as missionaries and converting monasteries. So that is a fairly clear image, but then after that, it drops off.
So I have a question, but before I do, I'll tell you that at the end, we'll invite everyone. We have a little reception of food across the hall. So for those who like food and conversation, this will all continue in just a few minutes. But first, one question for you, Joe, which is, as you're thinking about this kind of like decentering a certain story, so you get, okay, there's a kind of master story, and here you're getting kind of a peripheral story of these kind of smaller towns, different forms of migration, different kinds of local identity. Do you have a sense of what it might add up to? Like what the big payoff for this?
Yeah.
Okay, so you're getting the beginning of a different story to tell, a different way of interacting. It's non-Galuk. What might it be? What might be
Yeah. I mean, the larger argument that I haven't quite yet written that I'm going to try to make in the dissertation is primarily that, at least in the case of Spiti, these regional histories are embedded in this idea that need to write it down before I can say it clearly. But basically that Spiti was once an important place. And it was important because it was a center of Buddhism, but then the center of Buddhism shifts, so it must not be an important place anymore. And then now that Tibetans are in exile, there's an increased interest in the West, and that interest is coupled with this area is peripheral, therefore Buddhism must not be very good. So I think what's interesting is the idea that peripheries are not important Buddhist places, which is embedded in a Buddhist idea about what constitutes a proper place to be born, where the Buddhist teachings are flourishing and shining, and Tibet's own idea of itself as kind of a barbaric landscape that was civilized by Buddhism. So a lot of the Buddhist texts talk about these kind of hinterlands as if they are the borders of a mandala, like they're mapping this Buddhist idea onto the actual landscape, and then that becomes part of how they deal with people in the periphery of the landscape. So I think for me what's interesting is the relationship between sort of a geography and ideas of Buddhist authority, basically. That's what I think might be going on in Spiti. That might also be going on in other areas if one looked.
Thank you very much.